This is the Behringer VC340. I don't know about you, but I have wanted a keyboard vocoder in my life for a very long time. I've spent decades looking for them and trying to find one that was both functional, accessible, and a price that was remotely reasonable. And I really couldn't find the combination of all three for many, many years. I used to have a vocoder. I had an SVC340, which was wonderful. One of my first favorite instruments was the vocoder because I remember looking at the liner notes of ELO's Out of the Blue album and seeing the word vocoder and knowing that that was the instrument that made the super cool vocal synthesizer sounds. And I thought that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. So I was obsessed with them. So one night in 1991, I got a phone call from my brother and said, there is a vocoder at a pawn shop in Post Falls, Idaho. And I didn't live too far away from Post Falls. So the next morning I shot there like a shot and showed up. And you got to realize that this was like 1991 or so. There was no internet. At a pawn shop in Idaho, like Post Falls, Idaho, which is a small town. There's a good chance the pawnbroker isn't going to know what he has. So I was very, very excited. And so I brought it up to him and I'm like, what's this thing? Because I wanted to, play the whole bartering game. I'm like, what's this? And he's like, oh, that's a piece of studio equipment. I'm like, oh. Is this an equalizer? And he's like, yeah, it's kind of like an equalizer. And I'm like, well, now I know that's not untrue, but I honestly think he thought it was an equalizer. Anyway, so I was like, well, how much would something like this cost? And he kind of sized me up and realized he had a sucker. And he's like, I'm going to have to charge probably about $65 for that. And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, I don't know, man. Okay. And then I just gave him the $65 and I could see he was like, sucker. And like, sucker. Anyway, so I got the thing home and I used it on every single recording for about 10 years. And then eventually it just got to be like, oh, I'm going to use the vocoder. I've got to set it up. What's the keyboard I'm going to use with it? And it felt like a disconnect for me. So I eventually sold it when I realized I wasn't using it and I really wanted to go to England to play some gigs. So I sold it and I have missed it. But at the time I had it, I didn't really know how it could be used beyond the robot voice. And so in later videos in the series, I'll show you ways that you can use a vocoder that have nothing to do with robot voice. Anyway, so I sold it and I've wanted one back, but I really wanted a keyboard one. I wanted one that was all in one. This is the vocoder and I could play it as is without having to set a studio setup every time I use it. So that's why this is super exciting to me. Now, that has nothing to do with what we're going to be talking about right now, which is the string section. This not only is a vocoder, but it also has a string section and a human voice section, which were very useful in live performance, which were very useful in the late 70s and early 80s if you were in a live band, whether you were doing covers that had strings or choir in them, or you were a band who in the studio had recorded with strings and then didn't want to take an orchestra on tour. This was a tool that would be really, really useful for you. And that's, it goes along with all those other instruments that came out along the same time that were like 8 different synthesizers packed into one thing. This kind of is that same spirit for all of those bands. And I say bands because I know you'd like to believe that the vocoder is like this super futuristic electronic music instrument, but the fact of the matter is bands used it in the 70s all over the place. It was a common band instrument. So while you certainly could use it in a disco club or whatever, people wanted a vocoder. There were vocoders all over rock, more so than any other style of music. Anyway, but right now in this video, other than really long anecdotes, video starts at 5:21, I think is going to show up in the comments. Anyway, or actually it's probably more than, anyway. So let's talk about the string section present on the VC340 from Behringer. Okay. The layout of this is a little bit strange, so I can't really pursue it in the way that I typically would pursue a demonstration. So bear with me. Okay. Your first step is to go over into the balance section, which is actually your mixer, and choose the instrument that you want to use, unless you're using the vocoder, which would have you going towards mic level in the vocoder section. But anyway, we want to hear the strings, so I'm going to bring the strings up. Let's have a listen. Uh-oh, I don't hear anything. Well, that's because you also have to decide where you want the strings to be. This instrument has a novel keyboard split setup that is intertwined with the octave setup and is totally bizarre and interesting. So it's your job to choose what part of the keyboard you want the strings to appear on. Since we're right now just listening to the sound of them, I'm going to choose both lower and upper. But we'll get to the whole high, lower, upper, low, lower, upper, high, low, etc. here in a minute. But first, here are the strings. So we basically have 3 octaves starting here. And before we talk about octaves, I want to point out something that just happened. Get a load of this. Here, I'm going to turn it down while I do this. What's happening there? What's happening there, my friend, is full polyphony. Yes, this is a top octave divide keyboard, just like so many of its time and so many Roland keyboards of the time. It has 12 oscillators that are divided down to get the subsequent octaves. So the result is that you can play all the notes at once. It is fully polyphonic, which is super awesome. Sadly, it's paraphonic, but we'll get to that. Okay. But we've only been hearing 1 octave. If you come over here, you can see there's a high-low switch. This is where things begin to get a little wonky. Not really, but it's interesting. So we're in this octave. We switch this up. Now we're an octave higher. So basically your string section is missing the low end of the cellos and definitely the double basses. I'm sorry. But honestly, if you are making synthesizers for rock bands, the low end is usually covered by the bass or, some other or a synthesizer or something. So having the low end of the strings apparently wasn't necessary, although it seems like they could have just had a 3-space switch, but I don't know. I'm not going to criticize those who invented this, nor those who reproduced it, because let's face it, these strings are nice. They sound nice. You might notice in listening to them that they have a delightful stereo chorusing effect, which caused me to have to change my setup so I could record in stereo. I'm not complaining. I'm complaining a little bit. But yeah, there is a chorus effect, an ensemble effect that in the other instruments we can apply, but in the strings, it's on all the time, to avoid the problem that I suppose the Salinas have, where if you don't have the effect on, it just sounds like the most irritating sawtooth waves you've ever heard. Okay, so these are our strings.